Just after 5 p.m. on Halloween 1957, in a Los Angeles suburb called Sun Valley, 35-year-old Peter Fabiano turned off the lights at his beauty salon, flipped the sign in his shop window from open to closed, and got into his car to begin the short drive home. Peter turned onto a long residential street and pulled into the driveway of a corner house at the end of the block. Peter put the car in park and just sat for a moment. As he stared at the Halloween decorations his wife had hung on the windows, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He couldn't believe this was his house. And to him, his house was sort of a symbol of how dramatically his life had recently changed. Just a few short years earlier, Peter had felt completely lost. He was living by himself and struggling to make ends meet, and that's when he got mixed up with some bad people who said he could make some money working for them. Even though Peter had agreed to do this, he had known it was not a smart decision, and he was quickly proven right when he ran into trouble with the law. Peter ultimately avoided doing jail time, but this had been a wake-up call for him. After that, he had worked hard to clean up his act and to really start planning for his future. And his hard work eventually paid off. Now he was married and ran a successful business, and he owned a brand new home that had literally just been built. In short, Peter Fabiano was living the American dream. And on top of that, he was enjoying the kind of personal freedom that he had personally fought for on the front lines during World War II. Life was good. Peter strolled up his front walkway between the rows of carved Halloween pumpkins and stepped inside his house. His wife Betty walked up to him, carrying a large bucket full of candy, and as she placed the candy on a table near the door, Peter gave his wife a peck on the cheek. Betty smiled and then quickly turned and walked away. And Peter wondered if maybe Betty's smile was forced, and if maybe she was mad about something. As happy as Peter was about his job and his new house in the suburbs, he and Betty's marriage had its share of difficulties. In fact, just that summer, a few months earlier, things had gotten so tense between them that Betty had moved out for a while. But she had come back, and things had really seemed like they were getting better between them. And so Peter decided to ask a simple question just to gauge Betty's mood. He said, "Hey, have any trick-or-treaters come by yet?" And to Peter's relief, Betty laughed and told him it was still too early. All the trick-or-treaters were probably still eating dinner. Peter relaxed, convinced he'd been reading way too much into his wife's smile, and he started to get excited about handing out candy to a parade of children in funny costumes. In the 1950s in the United States, the act of trick-or-treating had really started to become a popular Halloween tradition for children, and the holiday itself was growing into the huge part of American pop culture that it is today. When Peter was a kid, he didn't get to go trick-or-treating. It wasn't really a thing back then. But now, even though he was an adult, he was quite happy to be a part of it, even if his role was just handing out candy. Peter's teenage stepdaughter, Judy, came bounding out of her room in full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. By 6 o'clock, shortly after Judy had left for her party, the sun was setting and the Fabiano's doorbell rang for the first time that night. Peter and Betty heard a chorus of young voices chanting "Trick or treat" from right outside the door. Betty smiled, put on her pointy black witch's hat, grabbed the bucket of candy by its handles, and opened up the door. In front of her stood a little boy in a robot costume, and on either side of him were what Betty assumed were his two big sisters, both dressed as fairies. Betty reached into her bucket and grabbed as much candy as her hand could fit, and then dropped the candy into each of the kids' bags. The kids thanked her and ran off. At this point, Peter walked up behind Betty to look outside, and he saw more children approaching. It looked like it was going to be a busy night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, after the last of the trick-or-treaters had come by the house, and Peter had picked up his stepdaughter Judy from her Halloween party, Peter walked into his bedroom and saw Betty reading in bed. He slipped into his pajamas and yawned. He thought about how he and Betty would have to be up at the crack of dawn tomorrow to get Judy to school, and also then to open the two salons they ran for a full day of appointments. And so all Peter wanted to do was just collapse and go to sleep. And so Peter slid into bed with Betty, who then put her book down on the nightstand and she turned off the lamp. As the couple lay in bed, Peter remarked to Betty that this time of the year was exhausting. Betty agreed. Decorating, hosting, entertaining, these things were hard work. She said now that Halloween was over, they would have to start sending invitations for Thanksgiving. And then as soon as Thanksgiving was over, they wouldn't even have time to breathe before they'd have to start decorating for Christmas and planning their big Christmas party. Peter joked that maybe next year they should just board up their house for the holidays and take an extended vacation. Betty started to laugh, but before she could say anything else, their doorbell rang. Peter sat up, switched on the lamp, and looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. He turned to Betty and said it seemed really strange that somebody would ring their doorbell so late. Betty thought it might just be a late trick-or-treater, even though more than 2 hours had passed since the last trick-or-treater had come by. Peter pushed himself out of bed. Maybe it was one of the earlier visitors coming back for seconds, he said. If so, it was their lucky night, because they still had more than enough candy to last through the new year. Peter put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and began walking towards the front door. And as he did, the doorbell rang again. And this time, Peter heard "trick or treat" from a voice calling out from the other side of the door. And so Peter picked up the bucket of candy on the side table, reached for the doorknob, and pulled the front door open. A few minutes later, Sun Valley police officer Bud Alper was fast asleep in his bed, 2 doors down from Peter and Betty's house, when suddenly this violent pounding noise jolted him awake. The pounding persisted as Alper slowly gained his bearings, and he realized that somebody was banging on the front door of his house. Alper picked up his watch from the nightstand and looked at the time, and when he saw how late it was, he instinctively began reaching for his service revolver. He had no idea what was going on, but someone banging on his door this late definitely couldn't be something good. But just then, he heard the sound of a young woman's voice, tearfully calling his name, pleading with him to open the door. Alper opened his front door, and through bleary eyes, he saw his teenage neighbor, Judy, the daughter of Betty Fabiano, standing there in her nightgown with tears streaming down her cheeks. Judy begged Alper to help her. Her stepfather had been shot, she said. He was lying on the floor of their house, dying. Alper ran out of the house and followed Judy to her front door and stopped just outside the doorway. Alper saw Peter lying motionless on the floor, partially blocking the entrance to the house. Alper quickly stepped over him and darted inside the house, and he saw Betty, Peter's wife, standing frozen in the hallway, with her hand over her mouth, looking like she was in shock. Alper asked where their phone was, and Judy pointed towards the kitchen. Five minutes later, an ambulance pulled up at the Fabiano's house, and paramedics picked Peter up, put him on a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Officer Bill Lehman of the Sun Valley Police Department parked his cruiser at the Fabiano house just as the ambulance left, and he walked up to the front door. Lehman greeted his fellow officer, Bud Alper, who was standing on the walkway in his pajama robe and lighting a cigarette. Standing near her was Mrs. Fabiano, who was sobbing, and when Officer Lehman approached her, she began to recount what had happened. Betty said that shortly after she and her husband had gone to bed, their doorbell had rang, and they both assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater. Betty said she had stayed in bed while Peter had gone to the door. From bed, Betty had heard her husband open the front door and say, "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" She then heard someone with a strange voice reply, "No," and a few seconds later, Betty heard a loud pop, followed by a thud. As Betty got out of bed and began running to the front of the house, she heard tires screeching and a car speeding away, and there, at the foot of the front door, she found her husband lying on the rug, bleeding from a wound in his chest. Betty told the officer that, based on the tone of her husband's voice after he opened the door, she was pretty sure that whoever he was talking to at the door was an adult, and she could almost swear that the voice she heard in response to him sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Lehman furrowed his eyebrows as he jotted down this strange detail in his notepad. Was the person at the door using a fake voice, because Peter would have recognized them otherwise? And if this was the case, did it mean they were also wearing some sort of costume? It was Halloween after all. Lehman walked back to his cruiser, reached inside of it, and then returned to the front door with a small box. He placed the box over the doorbell and secured it there with some tape. That way nobody could touch it before crime scene investigators showed up to dust for prints. Officer Lehman turned to Betty and asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Peter or wanted Peter dead. Betty hesitated just for a second and then shook her head. She said she couldn't think of anybody. A short time later, homicide detective Pat Keeley rolled up to the Fabiano house and took over the investigation. Officer Lehman briefed Detective Keeley on the details of what had happened, and then Keeley approached Betty. He took off his hat, lowered his head a bit, and said he hated to have to tell her this, but her husband Peter never regained consciousness, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Betty immediately broke down and began crying and hugged her daughter. Keeley stepped away to give the victim's grieving family members some space, and as the crime scene investigators showed up to process the scene, Keeley walked across the street to begin his neighborhood canvass. Keeley knocked on the door of the Fabianos' adjacent neighbors and asked if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. The neighbors told the detective that they had heard a loud pop, maybe about 15 minutes earlier, but aside from that, they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. As the detective scribbled this into his notepad, the neighbor suddenly remembered something he didn't think much of at the time. He said a couple of times that evening, when he would look out the window to see if there were any more trick-or-treaters coming, he noticed a car parked in the street that he'd never seen before. It was an older model, dark-colored sedan, and by his count, it had been parked there for maybe at least an hour, but now it was gone. The neighbor wished he could provide more information, but he didn't take note of the make or model, and he wasn't able to offer a description of anybody in the car. Keeley continued canvassing the neighborhood, but none of the other people on the block saw or heard anything unusual. So he returned to the Fabiano house, hoping that the crime scene investigators had found something useful that might help him close this case quickly. But the news from the other investigators was equally disappointing. There were no fingerprints on the doorbell and no shell casings at the scene. In fact, they hadn't uncovered anything at all, not a single piece of evidence. This crime scene was totally clean. A little later that night, Keeley returned to his desk in the homicide department to begin writing up the report. The 46-year-old veteran took a deep breath and exhaled in a long sigh. He knew he was in for a long night, and he was at an age where he was beginning to wonder if his 95% homicide clearance rate was worth the toll these long nights must be taking on his health. Keeley finished writing up the report and then began looking over what he'd written. He kept thinking how unusual it was that the killers took advantage of Halloween and used trick-or-treating as a ruse. He'd never heard of this happening before, except maybe in a radio play he once listened to. And the crime scene was so spotless. The killers were very careful to not leave anything behind. This suggested a level of planning and organization rarely seen in random killings and robberies. This had all the markings of a professional hit. The day after the murder, Detective Keeley drove down to the Hall of Justice and made his way to the Records Division. He wanted to find out if Peter had any sort of criminal background or maybe a connection to the mob that might have led a professional hitman to show up at his door and kill him. Keeley asked the records clerk for anything he could dig up on a Peter R. Fabiano. The records clerk disappeared into a back room, and a short time later, he returned with a file and handed it to Keeley. And the second Keeley opened that file up and began reading, he knew his instincts had paid off. Peter Fabiano did have a criminal record. About 9 years earlier, Peter had been a bookie, which meant he was setting up gambling bets, taking bet money, and paying out winnings. This was illegal, and Peter had been caught and convicted on a bookmaking charge. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but the sentence was ultimately suspended, and he never served any time. Keeley knew that bookies were often associated with organized crime, and he wondered how deep Peter's ties went. Could he have run afoul of a loan shark, or fallen in debt to the wrong people? Something like that would definitely support his professional killer theory. Detective Keeley spent the afternoon probing Peter's business records, his finances, his background, hoping to find other investigations and other shady dealings. Anything that might help Keeley build a list of Peter's potential enemies. But much to Keeley's surprise, aside from that one scrape with the law being a bookie almost a decade earlier, Peter really did seem to have cleaned up his life. He ran a legitimate business, which his wife helped him operate, and none of Peter's friends that Keeley had talked to could think of anyone who had beef with him. However, Keeley had yet to really have a deep conversation with the one person closest to Peter, and that would be Peter's wife and now widow, Betty. That evening, Betty Fabiano sat in a small room inside the Sun Valley Police Station. After waiting for a few minutes on her own, Detective Keeley walked in, sat down in a chair a few feet away from her, and asked her to take him through the night of Peter's murder again. Betty started recounting everything that had happened that day, starting from when she had finished working at one of the two salons she and Peter owned. Peter, at the time, was working at the other salon. Keeley listened closely, looking for any inconsistencies between this version of events and the story Betty had told him when he had first come to her house. Keeley was not ready to write off the idea that a hired killer had shot Peter, but maybe it wasn't the mob that hired them. Maybe it was the victim's wife. But as Betty spoke, Keeley didn't catch anything that strayed too far from her original story. Still, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Some people were good at memorizing stories. And so Keeley asked Betty to tell him more about her marriage to Peter. Betty explained that she and Peter had been married for about 3 years. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and one of those kids, her daughter Judy, lived with them. Keeley asked if she and Peter had any problems in their marriage. Betty paused, then took a deep breath, and admitted that, yes, there had been some marital problems. She said their marriage had become pretty rocky earlier that year, to the point where they actually had separated for a couple of months. Betty had moved out of the house during that time and went to live with a friend. But in July, she and Peter had reconciled, and she had moved back in with him. Betty looked away for a minute and was silent, and then she turned back to Keeley and said there was someone he should know about, someone who might have had it out for Peter. Keeley leaned in and asked her why she hadn't said anything about this person when he talked to her at the house. Betty said she wasn't trying to hide anything. She'd been in total shock at the house, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. But now that she was talking about her and Peter's relationship, it seemed obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did. In fact, the 2 women had quickly hit it off when they first met and had become friends. And this really bothered Peter. In fact, it bothered Peter so much that the friendship between Joan and Betty became a source of tension in their marriage, until Peter ultimately forbade his wife to socialize with Joan. Betty felt she had a right to choose her friends and was not going to let her husband control her, but Peter was insistent until Betty felt like he was basically giving her an ultimatum. And ultimately, this is the issue that led Betty and Peter to separate for those several months. However, Betty said after a couple of months of separation, she had a change of heart and returned home to Peter. And he accepted her back, but under the condition that she never see Joan and never even speak Joan's name around him again. As Keeley listened to the story, he found himself puzzled by it. It sounded like there had to be a piece missing somewhere. And so he asked Betty, why did Peter hate Joan so much? But Betty just sort of shrugged and looked away. Keeley couldn't tell if Betty was hiding this information because she knew more about Peter's murder than she was saying, or if she was trying to hide something to protect her dead husband or her friend Joan. Finally, Betty broke the silence and just said that Joan had a really strong personality, and Peter also had a strong personality. And sometimes 2 strong personalities can clash. The next morning, 2 days after Peter's murder, Keeley and his partner decided to pay Joan a surprise visit. They drove to Joan's house in Hollywood, on the other side of the hill, and knocked on her front door. The door swung open and Joan appeared, and as the detectives flashed their badges and said they were there to talk to her about Peter Fabiano, they watched Joan closely to see how she would react, whether she'd be nervous or surprised or something. But Joan just shook her head and looked down. She had already heard the news. How tragic, she said to the investigators. Keeley agreed and said it was tragic, but also her name had come up as a potential suspect, so they needed her to accompany them down to the station and answer some questions. Joan matter-of-factly just said, okay, and asked them to hold on a minute while she got her coat. And as she did that, the investigators shared a look, because honestly, this seemed really strange to them. In almost every homicide case they had ever worked, when somebody was told they were a potential suspect, they got scared or angry or had some kind of strong reaction. Neither of the cops had ever seen someone act so unaffected by this kind of news. They followed Joan inside the house and kept an eye on her while she grabbed her coat and her purse. And she remained totally calm and cooperative when the detectives walked her to their car and drove her back to the valley to police headquarters. As soon as Joan was sitting down inside of the interview room across from Keeley and his partner, she began to talk. Joan insisted that she had nothing to do with Peter's murder. She was not a violent person, she hated guns. In fact, she had never even touched a gun, not once in her whole life. And as Joan continued to talk, Keeley began to notice her calm demeanor slip just a little. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded sort of surprised. She told the detectives she had no idea what they'd heard or who they'd heard it from, but she had no problem whatsoever with Peter Fabiano. She considered both Peter and his wife Betty to be two of her closest friends, and she had only stopped working at the salon because she'd found another job. So, Joan suggested, whoever was pointing the finger at her, the police might want to take a closer look at them. Keeley and his partner exchanged another brief glance. What Joan was saying was a complete contradiction to what Betty had said. Keeley's partner asked Joan if she had an alibi for the night of the murder. She told them she did. She said she had been home all night by herself, but her car had been parked in the front of her house in her driveway, and she was sure one of her neighbors could confirm that. After speaking to Joan for a bit longer, Keeley had his suspicions, but he had no legal reason to hold Joan, so he gave her a ride back to her house. And after Joan went inside and closed the door behind her, Keeley began knocking on her neighbors' doors. And several of them did confirm what Joan told detectives. On the night Peter died, Joan's car never left her driveway. And considering that her house was 12.5 miles away from the Fabiano house, it did seem likely if she was involved somehow in the murder that she would have had to drive there. Keeley returned to the station, went right to his desk, and shook his head in frustration. Less than 2 days into this investigation, and he felt as though the case was already reaching a dead end. Beyond Peter's brief stint as a bookie, nothing had come up that showed he still had ties to organized crime, or that he owed money to anybody. Betty and Joan had told him wildly different stories about Joan's relationship with Peter, so he figured one of them had to be lying. But the lie didn't have to mean they were connected to the murder. The lie could be for some personal reason. And at this point, there was no clear evidence pointing to either of the women. Keeley definitely couldn't rule them out, but he also couldn't really pursue either of them unless some new piece of information surfaced. So Keeley picked up his case file and began scouring the dozen or so pages he'd put together so far, looking for anything he might have missed. But after an hour of studying the facts of the case, he put down the file and felt no closer to an answer. Keeley's nearly perfect homicide clearance rate, which was a great source of professional pride to him, seemed like it was about to take a hit. Nearly a week after the murder, on November 5th, 1957, Peter Fabiano was laid to rest. Following the funeral, Detective Keeley continued to interview Peter's friends and family, but these conversations never seemed to get him anything new. Several more weeks passed, and no matter how many times Keeley looked over his case file, he didn't get any closer to figuring out who had murdered Peter. And with nothing more to go on, and new cases piling up, Detective Keeley and his team turned their attention to other open investigations. The Fabianos' Thanksgiving dinner that year had one fewer face at the table, and while they ate, there was this sense of despair hanging over all of them. Like Keeley, Peter's family started to feel that Peter's case would just never get solved. But on a day not long after Thanksgiving, in early December, the telephone rang at the Sun Valley Police Department. A muffled voice on the other end of the line told the dispatcher they had a tip in the Peter Fabiano case. The caller said that if investigators went to Bullock's department store in downtown Los Angeles and visited the area with the rented storage lockers, they would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. This was the gun that was used to kill Peter Fabiano. The caller then provided a locker number and then hung up without giving their name. The dispatcher took down the information and quickly passed it along to Detective Keeley. Keeley was skeptical that this tip would lead anywhere. Whenever a case was all over the news like this one, he usually got at least one call from somebody just looking for attention. Rarely was a vital piece of information just handed to him. It's never that easy. But Keeley was a diligent investigator who followed up on basically every single lead. And so far, the Fabiano case had offered very few. So this was something worth looking into. So Keeley and his partner drove to downtown Los Angeles, entered the Bullock's department store, and had the locker attendant open up the locker the tipster had indicated. And when Keeley looked inside that locker, he couldn't hide his excitement because there inside of it was in fact a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Keeley asked the locker attendant whose name the locker had been rented under. The attendant opened a registration book, and when she read the name to Keeley, Keeley had never heard of them before. Keeley put the revolver into an evidence bag and drove it back to the station. He knew he would need to figure out where the gun came from, who the gun was registered to, and if the gun had ever been reported stolen. He also knew there was a good chance the locker had been rented under a false name, but he hoped the gun would still lead him to Peter's killer. So he called the state police and gave them the serial number of this gun. And within minutes, Keeley learned that the gun had been purchased on September 21st of that year, the month before the murder, from a gun shop in Pasadena, about 15 miles away. And the buyer of the gun was the very same person who rented the storage locker where the gun was found. This person had not used a fake name to get the gun or the locker. So Keeley could easily track them down, and he was now almost positive this person killed Peter. That evening, after obtaining a warrant, Detective Keeley and his partner arrested the person who had bought the gun and stored it in the locker. The detectives brought this person to the station and sat them down in the interrogation room, and as soon as the interview began, this person openly admitted to shooting Peter Fabiano. And they would tell investigators the entire story right from the very beginning all the way up to the aftermath of the killing. And once Keeley and his partner had all these details, all the pieces began falling into place. And everything that might have confused Keeley early on now suddenly made perfect sense. Based on the killer's confession and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Peter Fabiano on the night of October 31st, 1957. At around 9 p.m. that night, the killer, wearing face makeup and baggy clothes, sat in a parked car a few houses down from Peter's, and just watched and waited. Just after 11 p.m., so after sitting in the parked car for 2 straight hours, the killer saw the bedroom lights in the Fabiano house go off. At this point, the killer slipped a mask over their face and red gloves over their hands, and then climbed out of the car and began walking toward the Fabiano's front door, carrying a brown paper bag with a .38 caliber revolver hidden inside of it. The killer rang the doorbell, and as soon as they did, they began to shake, knowing they were about to commit a crime that could land them in the gas chamber. They tried to calm their nerves by reassuring themselves that this was the perfect crime and there was no way they'd get caught. They repeated this in their head as they rang the doorbell again and called out "trick or treat" in a loud, booming, unnatural voice. Peter opened the door, looked at the killer in their ill-fitting clothes and paper mask, and laughed. "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" he asked. All the killer could think to say was "no," as Peter looked down into his bucket and began fishing for candy. With Peter's attention distracted for just a moment, the killer began raising the gun, which was still concealed inside the paper bag. But as they did, their hands began to tremble violently, so they reached over with their other hand to keep themselves steady, and then continued lifting the gun with both hands. And once it was aimed squarely at Peter's chest, they fired a single shot. The bullet blew a hole through the paper bag and slammed into Peter's chest, the round settling just below his heart. Peter looked up at the killer in horror and then clutched his chest as he fell to the ground. The killer immediately turned around, cut across the yard, and ran back to the car. When they got into the passenger seat, they were shaking and on the verge of tears. They couldn't believe they had just killed a man. But the killer then felt a hand on their shoulder. They turned to the driver's seat, and saw the woman they loved had a smile on her face. The woman told the killer they had done everything just right. Then she hit the gas and sped away from the neighborhood. It would turn out Peter Fabiano's killer was a woman named Goldine Pizer. She was a 42-year-old lab assistant at a children's hospital, and she had no direct connection to Peter Fabiano. In fact, she had never met him before the night she killed him. She only knew what Peter looked like because another person had driven her by the Fabiano house a week before Halloween and pointed him out. And this other person was Goldine's only connection to Peter, and this other person was the actual mastermind behind the murder. And that was Peter's former employee, Joan Rabel. It turned out that Joan and Peter's wife Betty had both lied to police about their relationship. Joan and Betty were not just friends, they were lovers. But in 1957, that was not something most people would accept, so Betty and Joan tried to hide it. However, Peter still found out about their relationship, and when he did, he was livid. He fired Joan from his salon and forbade his wife from ever seeing Joan again. But instead of submitting, Betty left her husband and went to live with Joan. However, after a couple of months with Joan, Betty realized she was better off staying with Peter and broke off her relationship with Joan. Betty moved back in with Peter and agreed to never bring up Joan's name again. And it was at this point that Joan began plotting Peter's murder. Jilted and wanting revenge, Joan began a new relationship with the very impressionable Goldine and immediately began setting her up to become Peter's assassin. Joan spoke endlessly to Goldine about what an evil and vile person Peter Fabiano was. Joan claimed Peter was cruel to his wife and cruel to his wife's children, mistreated his employees, and was essentially a monster who needed to be stopped. Over time, Goldine grew to despise Peter just through Joan's portrait of him, and that's when Joan began actively putting her plan into motion. Goldine cared so deeply for Joan, she would have done just about anything for her. And so when she walked into that Pasadena gun shop on September 21st, she felt like she was doing a heroic thing. Once the two conspirators had their plan all worked out, they decided Halloween night was the best time to carry it out, because they knew Peter would be more likely to open his door to a stranger after a steady stream of trick-or-treaters had been to his house. On the night of the murder, Joan borrowed a friend's car, leaving hers in the driveway to create the alibi, and then went to pick up Goldine at her house. Joan then drove Goldine to the Fabiano street, waited in the car until the deed was done, and drove her back home. At which point, Joan told Goldine to forget they ever knew each other and vanished from her life. Once Goldine realized she'd been used and manipulated by Joan, who didn't actually care about her, the hold that Joan had over her was broken. So when Detective Keeley got the anonymous tip and tracked Goldine down, she was more than willing to tell him everything. Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were both charged with first-degree murder. Both women initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed their pleas to guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Joan and Goldine received sentences of 5 years to life in prison. As for Peter's widow, Betty Fabiano, she was never charged with any crime because investigators were satisfied that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. On the evening of November 16, 2013, 57-year-old Nancy Pfister stood in front of a crowded room of party guests inside of her house in Aspen, Colorado. Nancy held up a bottle of expensive champagne and called out to get everyone's attention. Her guests turned and watched their host like she was a queen holding court. Nancy had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like she could have been a model. She told the crowd that she was going to skip winter in the mountains of Colorado and head to the warm beaches of Australia, and she could not think of a better way to spend her last night in town than hanging out with all the people she loved. Nancy thanked everyone for coming, popped open the champagne, and told her guests to have fun. Music began to play, and the guests cheered, and then they all kind of began circulating through Nancy's massive house that sat on over 35 acres of land. And they could look out through these huge floor-to-ceiling windows to get an incredible view of Nancy's property that was covered in aspen trees and surrounded by the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. A lot of Nancy's friends were some of the wealthiest people in Aspen, which was known as one of the wealthiest cities in America, so this was saying something. But the view from Nancy's house was so spectacular, it still made all of her friends a bit jealous. Nancy poured herself a glass of champagne, took a sip, and looked out at everyone with a huge grin on her face. Hosting parties was one of her favorite things to do. In fact, over the decades, Nancy's parties had become sort of legendary. Nancy had inherited millions of dollars and part of the successful ski resort her parents had owned. So Nancy had always had money, and she had always played hostess to the rich and famous who vacationed in Aspen. She had also been briefly engaged to the actor Michael Douglas, she was still good friends with the very famous actor Jack Nicholson, and she'd even hung out with the Dalai Lama. She was also known to have regularly gotten drunk with Hunter S. Thompson, the very famous author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who had unfortunately taken his own life, actually not far from Aspen, back in 2005. Nancy walked through the large open front room of her house and began to mingle with some of her guests. But she had her eye on a particular couple that was sitting on the couch. Nancy waved to them, and their faces lit up. Dr. Trey Styler and his wife were in their 60s, but Trey had been dealing with some pretty serious health issues, so he actually looked 10 years older than he was. He often had trouble standing, and walking for long periods of time was a big challenge, but he still had a sharp mind and an amazing sense of humor, which is actually why Nancy liked him so much. She thought he was really funny. Nancy walked over to Trey and his wife, who also happened to be named Nancy, and she sat down next to them on the couch. And then she asked them how they were enjoying the party. They said they were having a great time, but admittedly, they were already plotting how to clean up the house afterwards, and Nancy smiled and laughed. When Nancy had made her plans to travel to Australia, the Stylers had been looking for a new home in the area, and when Nancy found out about it, she suggested they put that off and just rent her place while she was gone. And she actually said they could just move in right away if they wanted to, that way the house would feel more like a home when they were actually on their own. The Stylers had jumped at the chance, they loved Nancy's house like everybody did, and they always had a great time with Nancy, so the three of them had basically been roommates for the last several weeks, and as much as Nancy was looking forward to traveling in Australia, she was going to miss spending time with the Stylers. And Trey and his wife felt the same way. Trey had been a very successful anesthesiologist before his health forced him to retire, but like Nancy, he had inherited a lot of money, so the two of them shared similar backgrounds and seemed to really connect with each other. Nancy was still talking to the Stylers when she heard someone calling her name. She glanced up and saw her friend, Kathy Carpenter, was standing there looking totally panicked. Kathy told Nancy that she really needed to talk to her right now. Nancy told Trey and his wife she'd catch up with them later, and then she stood up and walked with Kathy to a secluded corner of the room. Other guests watched as Nancy and Kathy huddled together and began to talk. It was something they were all used to seeing, but most of them didn't understand why Nancy even bothered with Kathy. Nancy and the majority of her friends were part of a group that others called Aspen Royalty. Basically, they were people who seemed to have enough money to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And a lot of them were self-proclaimed snobs who wanted nothing to do with people outside of their own social class. But Nancy was different. She made friends everywhere she went and didn't care if people had money or not. Kathy was a bank teller in town, and every time Nancy had gone to the bank, she thought Kathy seemed like a very nice person. So one day, Nancy had asked Kathy if she'd like to go to lunch, and Kathy said she'd love to. And the two women hit it off and had become close friends ever since. Now, even though Nancy didn't seem to care about their very different social classes, Kathy couldn't ignore it. And so quickly after becoming friends, Kathy began doing things like picking up Nancy's prescriptions at the pharmacy for her and going to the grocery store to make sure Nancy had her food, and she even helped keep track of how much money Nancy spent, even if Nancy didn't seem to care. And so whether Kathy or Nancy realized this, basically, Kathy had become Nancy's personal assistant, even though obviously Kathy was not getting paid to do this and still had to have her job at the bank to make ends meet. And so back at the party in the corner of the room, Nancy asked Kathy what was so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the party. And Kathy said she was just worried that not everything in Nancy's life had been settled before her Australia trip. And also, Kathy wanted to know if Nancy wanted Kathy to look after her house while she was gone. This was something that Kathy kind of automatically did for Nancy anytime Nancy was out of town. Again, sort of acting like her assistant, even though she wasn't. Nancy was sort of annoyed by this. She didn't feel like talking about this right in the middle of the party, and so she tried to just kind of softly end the conversation with Kathy, but Kathy was persistent and really wanted to know what Nancy needed while she was going to be gone. And so finally, Nancy told Kathy that yes, it would be great if you stopped by the house once in a while and made sure her dog was okay. And also, if Trey and his wife, who were going to be staying at Nancy's house, needed anything, well, it would be great if Kathy could help them with that too. And so Kathy nodded, understanding her assignments, and then Nancy took a swig of her champagne, flashed a smile, and then rejoined the party and left Kathy standing all alone in the corner. Three months later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2014, Kathy opened up Nancy's front door with her own key. She walked into the front room, and she found Dr. Trey Styler and his wife waiting for her. Trey sat in a wheelchair with a couple of suitcases at his side, and Nancy's dog was laying at his feet. Over the past few months, Trey's health problems had only gotten worse, and he was really struggling to walk a lot of the time. Kathy looked frazzled, like she often did, and she asked the Stylers if they had everything and if they were ready to go. A few days earlier, Nancy had emailed Kathy to say she was coming home from Australia. When Nancy had left, she actually had not set a return date, at least not officially, but now this email served as letting people know she was coming back home. And so Kathy wanted to make sure everything in the house was perfect for Nancy when she got home, and that meant making sure Nancy had the house to herself. So Kathy had informed the Stylers that they needed to get out of the house and take all their belongings with them so she could straighten up before Nancy got there. In the front room, Trey leaned down, grabbed one of the suitcases, and put it on his lap. Trey's wife grabbed the other suitcase and told Kathy they were ready to go. But she said they were leaving a few things behind that they would want to come back to get. Kathy suddenly was panicked and said they really needed to make sure everything was out of the house. But in a calm, steady voice, Trey told her that everything was fine. He reminded Kathy that they had been paying rent on the house. They were not just guests here. They didn't want to cause any problems, but they were sure Nancy would be okay with having some of their things still in the house just for a few more days. Then Trey pushed himself through the room towards the front door, and his wife and Kathy followed. They made it outside, and right away Trey began to shiver. The sun was shining, but there was snow on the ground, and it was only about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, so right below freezing. Trey had also lost quite a bit of weight recently, which contributed to him feeling cold. His wife helped him into Kathy's car, and then put his wheelchair and their suitcases in the trunk. Then Kathy hopped in the driver's seat and drove the couple a few miles away to the hotel where they were going to stay until their new house was ready. And then after dropping the couple off, Kathy headed back to Nancy's. That evening, Kathy drove to the airport with Nancy's dog in the back seat. She knew Nancy would be thrilled to see him as soon as she landed. A little later, after flying for almost 24 hours and experiencing a massive 16-hour time change, Nancy finally stepped off the plane in Colorado. She somehow felt exhausted, but also completely wired, and she really had no idea what day it was. Kathy met Nancy at the baggage claim and helped her get everything over to the car. Nancy climbed into the back seat, and her dog jumped on her and licked her face. Nancy was glad to be back. When they got back to Nancy's house that evening, even though Nancy was dealing with major jet lag and felt totally exhausted, no matter what she tried, she couldn't fall asleep. So Kathy just stayed with her that night to make sure she really was okay, and that if she needed anything, she would go get it. And then for the next 36 hours, Nancy just really couldn't quite fall asleep, and so she was just totally exhausted and miserable. But then finally, on the morning of February 24th, so a day and a half after Nancy got home, she just totally crashed. Kathy stayed in the bedroom with Nancy for a bit, but when it was clear Nancy really had fallen asleep and was not going to wake up anytime soon, Kathy went down to the kitchen, and she made sure Nancy's dog had plenty of food and water, and then she found a piece of paper and a marker, and she made a do not disturb sign. Kathy knew that secretly, Nancy hated being woken up before she was ready, and so she did not want anybody to disturb Nancy. And so Kathy walked outside, and she taped the sign to the front door. Then she got into her own car and drove back to her own apartment. On the morning of February 26th, so 2 days after Kathy left Nancy's house when Nancy had finally fallen asleep, Trey and his wife came back to Nancy's house to get the rest of their stuff. They saw the do not disturb sign that was on the door, and they assumed Nancy had to be sleeping, but they still wanted to get their things, and they also really wanted to talk with Nancy to make sure everything was okay with the house. So Trey's wife used her key and they opened the door, and the second they went inside, they were hit with this horrible smell. Trey covered his mouth and nose and wanted to go back outside, but his wife said she heard something and she rushed to the kitchen. There, she saw Nancy's dog pacing back and forth and squealing. His food and water bowls were empty, and he had used the kitchen floor like a bathroom. Trey's wife looked at the scene completely confused. Nancy could be flighty sometimes and leave town almost on a whim, but she loved her dog and always made sure he was well taken care of anytime she was gone. But Trey's wife told herself, maybe Nancy hadn't heard the dog squealing because she was in a really deep sleep, still worn out from her trip. So she went upstairs, walked down the hall to Nancy's bedroom, opened the door, and went inside. And And when she did, she felt even more confused about the whole situation, because Nancy wasn't in there, and it looked like her bed had been totally stripped, like Nancy had gone to do a load of laundry and never came back or something. Trey's wife immediately headed right back downstairs and found her husband still waiting by the door, and she told him what she saw. So Trey's wife called Kathy at the bank where she was working and filled her in. When Kathy heard what was going on, she said this all sounded really strange because Nancy had been sleeping when she left the house, and Kathy had made sure the dog had plenty of food and water. So did this mean Nancy hadn't checked on the dog in over 2 days? Trey's wife said she would clean it all up, take the dog out, and make sure he was okay and fed before she left, but she was worried about Nancy. Kathy said she felt the same way. So she hung up and called Nancy, but it went straight to voicemail. So she sent Nancy several text messages and also an email. But by 5:30 p.m., when Kathy got off work, she still hadn't heard anything from Nancy. So she drove straight to Nancy's house. A few minutes later, Kathy arrived at Nancy's. She first checked on the dog and then went upstairs to Nancy's bedroom. And when she went inside, she saw the bed was stripped, just like Trey's wife had said. Kathy walked about 15 feet across Nancy's bedroom to a large walk-in closet. Now, this closet was bigger than a lot of people's bedrooms, and Nancy had actually converted it into a meditation room. She had hung Tibetan prayer flags on the wall and filled it with candles and personal keepsakes. Kathy knew that Nancy did not like anyone going in that closet, but she knew she had to go in because she had to find Nancy. And so Kathy first knocked on the door of this meditation room, but it was silent inside. So she eventually reached down and grabbed the doorknob, but when she turned it, she felt that it was locked, and Nancy's key to the closet was nowhere to be found. So Kathy ultimately walked back downstairs, went outside, got in her car, and sped back to her apartment, and there she grabbed her duplicate key to Nancy's walk-in closet that Kathy kept on its own keychain, and then with the key in hand, she drove back to Nancy's house. At about 5:45 p.m., Kathy walked into Nancy's bedroom again, and this time she saw something she'd overlooked. There was a small splash of blood on the headboard of the bed, and when she saw this, Kathy began to shake. Then Kathy slowly turned towards the meditation room, the walk-in closet, and she began walking in that direction. And when she got there with shaking hands, she used her key and opened the door. And when she looked inside, at first it looked like the way it always did, with all the different keepsakes and the flags and the candles. But right as Kathy was about to leave, she noticed something on the ground. And when she looked more closely, she began to scream. Kathy immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911. And when the operator answered, Kathy could barely speak. She was basically hyperventilating. But finally, she did manage to shout that her friend, Nancy Pfister, was dead inside of her closet, and she was sure Nancy had been murdered. Kathy's 911 call took the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department by complete surprise. Crime was rare in Aspen, Colorado, and there hadn't been a murder in town in over a decade. And on top of that, almost everybody in the area knew who Nancy Pfister was. She was basically a celebrity in Aspen. If Nancy really had been murdered, the county police knew this would be their highest profile case in a very long time. So they immediately reached out to the state police and the district attorney's office for help. And not long after that, an investigator with the DA's office named Lisa Miller parked her car in the long driveway in front of Nancy's house and stepped outside. Investigator Miller was tall with light brown hair, and she was wearing a gray wool overcoat and dark sunglasses. Miller had a reputation for being a staunch advocate for victims and for being very straightforward when dealing with suspects. From where she was standing, Miller looked around and saw all the huge aspen trees spreading out across Nancy's huge property, and she was also able to look inside of Nancy's house through her large front windows, and it was beautiful inside. And so Miller thought, this is like one of the most beautiful places she'd ever seen, if it wasn't for the fact that county police officers were stretching crime scene tape all across the yard. Miller saw a couple of deputies talking with Kathy a few feet from Nancy's front door, and she also saw Sheriff Joey DeSalvo standing nearby with Nancy's dog. Miller waved to DeSalvo and walked over to him. She asked him if he had seen the body yet, but DeSalvo just shook his head, and Miller could tell he was on the verge of tears. DeSalvo said Nancy was a good friend of his. Before he was sheriff, he'd had a bit of a wild side, and actually he and Nancy used to party together. And he also said that he was the one who'd been called in to deal with Hunter S. Thompson's body after the writer had killed himself, and seeing someone he knew covered in blood like that had haunted DeSalvo for years, so he couldn't bring himself to go look at Nancy's body. Miller said she understood and just told him that he would need to tell her everything he knew. DeSalvo nodded and said that Kathy, the friend of Nancy's who had found the body and called 911, had told him that when she went into the bedroom closet, she had found her friend's body on the floor. Nancy's body was wrapped up in some sheets and a carpet, and her hair was matted with blood. That's about all he knew as far as the body was concerned. But there was one more thing that Kathy had told him. Kathy said that she had noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing from her bathroom. Miller thanked DeSalvo, slipped on a pair of gloves, and then walked inside the house with one of the sheriff's deputies. Miller and the deputy headed upstairs and walked directly into Nancy's bedroom. They noticed the bed was stripped, and they saw blood on the headboard. Then they stepped into the closet that had been turned into a meditation room and looked down at the floor. But for a second, they both just stood there confused, because it just looked like there was a blanket and a pile of sheets laying there. And so Miller crouched down, and it wasn't until she was right over the blanket and sheets that she could tell they were actually wrapped around something. Miller kept staring at the pile for a second, and then she asked the deputy if Kathy had mentioned moving the blanket or touching it in some way. But the deputy said, according to Kathy, she had not touched anything in the closet. This made no sense to Miller, because at this moment, it was really impossible to tell if what was wrapped up inside of these sheets and this carpet was actually Nancy Pfister's body. And Miller definitely couldn't see any blonde hair matted with blood nearby like Kathy claimed to have seen inside of this closet. Miller nodded to the deputy, and so he crouched down, and together, they began to unwrap the blanket and the sheets. And as they did, they heard a strange sound, like the sheets were rubbing against something plastic. And then finally, once they had unspooled the bedding, they tossed it aside, and what they were left with was blood-stained trash bags wrapped around a dead body. Miller began to remove the trash bag covering the victim's head, and this is when she saw blonde hair matted with blood, just like Kathy had said. Miller finally pulled the trash bag all the way away, revealing the victim's face, and immediately the deputy lowered his head and told Miller that that was definitely Nancy Pfister. Miller wanted to wait for the state forensics team to arrive before handling the body anymore, so she and the deputy stepped out of the closet and began to search the rest of the house. But during the search, Miller didn't find any signs of forced entry or of a robbery. I mean, expensive paintings still hung on the wall, and Nancy's electronics and computer were plainly visible but looked untouched. And so Miller headed back outside into the cold winter air, and she saw Kathy, so she walked over to her and introduced herself, and she told Kathy they would need to talk at length at some point. But for now, Miller said she only had one question. Had Kathy touched the blanket or the sheets on the floor inside of that closet? Kathy shook her head and said no. She said she really had not touched anything in the closet, and as soon as she saw her friend's body on the floor, she called 911. And so Miller thanked her and went back inside of Nancy's house. Not long after Miller's initial sweep of the house, state forensics officers arrived on the scene. They followed Miller to Nancy's bedroom and began searching for prints, and they also took a sample from the blood spatter on the headboard. Then they flipped over the mattress and found several large bloodstains on it. After that, the officers went into the closet and began to do a thorough search of the body. All the while, Miller kept looking back and forth between the closet and the bed. The bloodstains on the headboard and the mattress made it seem like Nancy had been attacked in bed and then dragged, 15 feet or so across the room to the closet. The killer had also flipped the mattress over to try to hide the bloodstains and then clearly wrapped the body up in bedding and trash bags. And this was not an easy task. Just moving Nancy's body around would have been heavy and cumbersome, and there were so many steps the killer had to complete before leaving the house. And so as a result, Miller knew the killer would have needed a lot of time after killing Nancy, and also a lot of strength to pull this off. Or the killer would have needed a partner. And so Miller thanked the forensics officers and headed back downstairs, and she was still taking in everything she'd seen and heard, but at this point, she was sure about one thing. Kathy had lied to the police, because Nancy's body was not visible inside of the closet. And so if Kathy said she had seen her friend's blonde hair matted with blood, that meant either she did move the blankets and the carpet and that's how she saw it and then covered it back up, or Kathy just knew Nancy's hair was matted with blood because Kathy had killed her or had assisted in killing her. Investigator Miller knew that the murder of a wealthy socialite would send shockwaves through Aspen, and it would quickly lead to gossip and panic among locals and vacationers, so she didn't waste any time. Not long after Miller searched Nancy's house, she told Kathy to come down to the sheriff's station to meet with her and county and state police investigators. That day, Kathy stepped into the small interview room at the station. Kathy was average height with long brown hair, and she wore jeans and a red sweatshirt. And she looked very upset from the moment she sat down directly across from Miller. Miller spoke calmly and quietly. She thanked Kathy for coming in and then asked her to walk them through all the details of what happened when she went inside of Nancy's house, all the way through to calling 911. Kathy said when she'd gone to Nancy's the first time, she noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing, and she also noticed the closet door, the meditation room, was locked. And then when she went looking for the key to that closet that she knew Nancy always kept in her bedroom, she found it was gone. And so this was all very strange. And so that's what led Kathy to go back to her place, get her own key to the closet, and rush back to Nancy's house. Then suddenly, Kathy's voice trailed off and she began wailing and heaving and struggling to breathe. The investigators worried she was hyperventilating, like she had during her 911 call. But despite Kathy's hysterics, Miller noticed something about Kathy that was very strange. Even though Kathy was visibly sobbing, Miller couldn't see any tears. Miller did not like to judge how people grieved, but she had seen suspects act like this before. And they often used these huge displays of emotion to try to cover up their own guilt, or to at least avoid answering questions. Finally, when Kathy calmed down, Miller immediately began asking questions. She asked Kathy again if she had touched the bedding or Nancy's body when she went into the closet. Miller wanted to give Kathy a chance to change the story that she'd told her at the house. But Kathy said she had not touched Nancy. When she was in the closet, she had just looked at the floor, saw her friend's bloody hair, and immediately knew Nancy was dead. At this point, Miller sat up straight in her chair. Her height could make her intimidating, but her demeanor always remained totally calm. Miller thought there was a good chance Kathy was lying, but there was also a chance Kathy had been so upset that she really didn't remember everything that happened. People in shock can forget things, so maybe Kathy had partially uncovered Nancy's body, covered it back up, and then sort of blocked it out of her mind. Another deputy in the room pushed the interview forward and asked Kathy if she resented Nancy for her money. Was she angry that she had to run around doing errands for Nancy while never getting paid a dime for it? But Kathy shook her head. She said it wasn't like that. She and Nancy were extremely close and they loved each other. And something about the way Kathy said that struck Miller as strange. She couldn't be sure, but this woman seemed like more than just a broken-hearted friend. So Miller leaned in and asked Kathy if she and Nancy were actually lovers. Kathy looked very surprised by this question, but she took a deep breath and looked very calm for the first time in the interview, and then she said that she and Nancy had been intimate, but only one time and that it didn't matter. They were just friends who cared about each other. Kathy insisted that she was not some kind of jealous girlfriend and that she had nothing to do with Nancy's murder. Miller didn't show any sort of reaction on her face. She had no idea if Kathy was actually telling the truth about being intimate with Nancy only once, but she thought that if it was true, certainly once could have been enough to complicate the relationship. And so after a tense silence, Miller asked if Kathy could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her friend. Kathy sat there silent. An angry look came across her face, and then she nodded. She said she had a pretty good idea of who wanted to kill Nancy. It was Dr. Trey Styler and his wife. After the interview with Kathy, investigator Miller thought that Kathy was either directly involved with the murder or just knew more than she was letting on. Kathy had easy access to Nancy's house and a key to the walk-in closet where Nancy had been found. Kathy also had a sexual relationship with Nancy at least one time, and she seemed to know details about the body that only the killer would know. But all the evidence pointing at Kathy was still circumstantial, so for the time, police let her go home. Soon after Kathy left, county officers located Trey and his wife at the hotel where they were staying, and they asked them to come to the station. When Trey walked into the interview room for his interview, Miller was taken aback by how frail this man looked. He clearly struggled to walk, and he was extremely underweight for his height. This just was not a guy with the physical strength to murder Nancy, then wrap her up, drag her to the closet, and then flip over a mattress. It just was not possible. But Kathy, in her interview, really seemed to think that Trey and his wife were capable of killing Nancy and had wanted to kill Nancy, so Miller began by asking Trey about his relationship with Nancy and his time living alone inside of her house. Trey would admit that Nancy could be very difficult to deal with as a landlord. She was terrible at keeping records and often thought she was owed money that she had already been paid. But Trey had said that working with Kathy and Nancy's attorney had made things a lot easier, so any issues he might have had with renting the house always got worked out. When Trey's wife had her interview, she basically said the same thing as her husband. And even though she was not frail like her husband, investigators did not think this slight woman in her mid-60s could have physically carried out the murder on her own either. So by the time Trey and his wife left the station, investigators still believed that Kathy was the most likely suspect. And Miller thought there were two key pieces of evidence they needed to find to directly link Kathy to the murder. There were Nancy's missing pills and Nancy's missing key to the closet. On February 28, 2014, 2 days after Nancy's body was discovered, a county sanitation worker walked along a street checking the public trash cans. A lot of mountain towns in Colorado have strict rules about what can and can't be deposited in public trash cans in an effort to keep bears away. And so sanitation workers literally check the trash cans to make sure these rules are being followed. And so this worker opened a trash can out in front of some shops, and right away something caught his eye. In an open bag, he saw several pill bottles. This type of personal trash was not going to attract bears, but it was still not allowed in public trash cans. So he leaned in to grab the bag, and when he got closer, he saw the name on the bottles, Nancy Pfister. Like everybody in the area, the worker knew about Nancy's murder, so he immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Investigator Miller got word that the missing pills had been found, and she couldn't believe her luck. It was like a prayer had been answered. Then, the following day, a man was walking down the sidewalk not far from where the pills had been found, and he saw something on the ground, glinting in the sunlight. He bent down and saw it was a key, and there was a tag on the keychain that said Owner's Closet. He picked it up and handed it over to a county police officer who was parked nearby. And back at the sheriff's department, it did not take long for officers to realize that this key was the missing key to Nancy's meditation room. And so investigators started to feel like they must have a guardian angel or something. In the span of 2 days, 2 random people had located key pieces of evidence that helped break the case wide open. Because the locations where the key and the pill bottles had been found made it pretty clear who had gotten rid of them. So, over the next couple of weeks, investigators followed up on the evidence, shored up their case, and then made an arrest. Then, about 3 months later, in June, investigator Miller, along with officers from the county and state police, sat in an interview room and listened to the killer's full confession. Based on that confession, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators were told happened to Nancy Pfister on the night of February 24th, 2014. That night, the killer stood at the bottom of Nancy's stairs inside of her house, holding several trash bags and an electrical cord in one gloved hand and a hammer in the other. They walked up the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise. Once they reached the second floor, they headed down the hall and walked into Nancy's bedroom. The killer saw Nancy asleep in her bed. She had her headphones in, and she was wearing an eye mask to block out any light. This put the killer at ease. It didn't look like Nancy was going to wake up and fight back. So the killer walked over to the bed and put down the trash bags and the cord, but kept the hammer in their hand. Then they just stood there staring at Nancy as she slept. After taking a breath, the killer slowly raised that hammer up into the air and then smashed it down into Nancy's head. The killer felt Nancy's skull crack, but they immediately raised the hammer again and kept swinging it down at her head and face. As they did, blood splashed against the headboard and ran down into the mattress. Eventually, the killer stopped their frenzied attack and lowered the hammer, and then stared down at Nancy's now dead body. Then they dropped the hammer onto the trash bags, and then took the top blanket off the bed and placed it on the floor. Then the killer quickly pulled the bloody sheets off the bed and threw those on top of Nancy's body, and then they grabbed the corners of the blanket and began to drag the blanket with Nancy on top of it over to the walk-in closet. When they reached the closet, the killer noticed Nancy's key was sticking out of the lock on the closet door. So they dropped the blanket, used the key to open the door, and then dragged Nancy inside the closet. Then they ran back into the bedroom, grabbed the trash bags, and went back into the closet. There, the killer crouched down and wrapped Nancy's head in one of the bags. They cinched it tight around her neck using the electrical cord. Then they also wrapped up her torso and her legs with the other trash bags. Once they were satisfied, the killer also wrapped Nancy in her own bed sheets, as well as her own blanket, and then left her right in the middle of the closet. The killer stood up and looked down at the floor where Nancy was, and to them, it was barely even noticeable that a body was under all those layers. So they stepped out of the closet, closed and locked the door, and pocketed Nancy's key. Then they went back to Nancy's bed and flipped it over so the blood wouldn't show. Then the killer went into the bathroom and took a few pill bottles from the counter. They figured this might make it look like Nancy had just taken off for a few days. Finally, the killer headed downstairs, carrying the hammer and the pills in their hands, and as they exited the house, they could hear the sound of Nancy's dog barking in the kitchen. But they didn't care. They just rushed out to their car, hopped inside, and drove a few miles away to the hotel where they were staying. In the days following Nancy's murder, investigators came to believe that Kathy was involved, because it looked like she had lied, and because she knew details that she could not have seen without handling the body. But then, police received those two key pieces of missing evidence, Nancy's pill bottles and her closet key, and they were both found right near the hotel where Trey and his wife were staying. And when investigators followed up with them, they discovered that Trey and his wife's relationship with Nancy had actually totally fallen apart while Nancy was in Australia. Nancy was not just absent-minded when it came to getting her rent, like Trey had suggested. Instead, she was aggressive and kind of a bully. She wanted the Stylers to pay several months' rent, which was over $13,000, in cash all at once. But Trey insisted that was not what they had agreed to, and his medical bills were draining his savings, so paying that all at once really was not an option. Over the course of Nancy's trip, both parties got their attorneys involved and started accusing the others of trying to rip them off. So by the time Nancy finally flew back to Colorado, Trey and his wife had made it clear they were very, very angry at her. In fact, they had told Kathy on several occasions that they wished Nancy was dead. And it would turn out Kathy had basically said the same thing to the Stylers. She also seemed fed up with Nancy, specifically the demands Nancy kept putting on her. And she said there was a dark and cruel side to Nancy that really only people close to her saw. Her public perception is she was not this snobby, awful person, but, behind closed doors, at least to Kathy and to the Stylers, she was. When investigators learned all of this, they no longer believed Trey and his wife were innocent, but they also didn't believe that this couple was physically capable of committing this murder without help. So investigators became convinced that the Stylers and Kathy had killed Nancy together. And in March of 2014, police arrested Trey, his wife, and Kathy. But then in June, when all three suspects were behind bars, investigator Miller sat and listened to a full confession, but that confession only came from Trey. He claimed he had planned and carried out the murder all by himself. His wife and Kathy had nothing to do with it. In fact, Trey explained that he'd experienced this insane jolt of adrenaline on the night of the murder, something he had never felt before, that made it feel like he had no health problems. And so he said that was how he was able to kill Nancy with a hammer, drag her body to the closet, and wrap her up in blankets, sheets, and trash bags. And so based on Trey's confession, his wife and Kathy were eventually released from jail. Trey was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison, but in 2015, he hanged himself in his cell. After Trey's death, his wife received a $1 million life insurance payout, and she would go on to write a book about Nancy Pfister's murder. To this day, some people involved in this investigation do not believe Trey Styler acted alone, that basically he confessed in order to protect Kathy and his wife. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Before we go any further, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Experian. Back when I was just a young buck in college, I was broke. And so naturally, I took out a credit card with a $5,000 limit and immediately maxed it out on buffalo chicken calzones and beer. Now, as soon as my card got declined, I didn't pay it off. Instead, I just took the card, tucked it back into my wallet, and forgot about it. But the bank did not forget about my $5,000 debt, and my failure to pay it back wrecked my FICO score. A FICO score is a type of credit score. Over the last 10 years, I've been able to rebuild my credit score, but it has been a slow and painful process. And so my suggestion to you is to avoid the unpaid beer and calzone credit trap and just closely monitor your credit score. And with Experian, you can do that for free. In addition to closely monitoring your credit score, they will also send you alerts anytime your credit changes. Experian also offers a dark web scan. If you've ever been the victim of a data breach, and you may not know if you have or not, your information potentially could live in the dark web. And that's a place where criminals could use it to commit fraud. And if that happens, it'll wreck your credit along with a bunch of other horrible things, unless you catch it and report it. And on that, if you do find inaccuracies on your credit report, you can easily submit disputes and track those disputes on Experian's online dispute center. It is time to take charge of your credit. Get Experian credit monitoring, alerts, your FICO score, and that dark web scan all for free. Just go to Experian.com/Mr. Ballin. Again, that's EXPERIAN.com/Mr. Ballin. Okay, back to the story. Hey everybody, if you've not heard by now, our flagship podcast, Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, that pretty much immediately rocketed to the top of the charts when we launched in 2022, and then quickly was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the same year. Yeah, that show, our top show, is now available everywhere. It is no longer just on Amazon Music. It's on all platforms and it's free, which means if you've not listened to this podcast since it went exclusive with Amazon Music back in November of 2022, then that means you have about 100 new stories that are only on the podcast that are only now being made available to everybody. So go binge them. And if you signed up for Amazon Music just for this podcast, I love you. Thank you so much. But most importantly, there are still going to be perks for you if you continue to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music. Prime members will get to listen to the Mr. Ballin podcast 30 days earlier than everybody else, and Prime members will get to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music with no ads. But again, the Mr. Ballin podcast is now available worldwide on every podcast platform, and it's totally free. So please, if you would, go find the Mr. Ballin podcast on your choice podcast platform, whether that's Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple or whatever. Give us a follow, listen to an episode, and then please rate the podcast and leave a review. It does an enormous amount for the growth of the show. I'd really appreciate it. All right, back to the stories. If you didn't hear the huge announcement we made last week, well, here it is again. The Mr. Ballin podcast, our top podcast, the one we launched in 2022 that immediately rocketed to the top of the charts, and then by the end of that same year, it got picked up by Amazon. Yeah, that show is now once again available on every podcast platform, and it's free. All you gotta do is go to your choice podcast platform and look for the Mr. Ballin podcast, and boom, you now have access to the hundreds of episodes in our catalog. And if you haven't listened to the podcast since it went exclusive at the end of 2022, then you have a crazy amount of content to go binge. So go find the Mr. Ballin podcast on whatever platform you like, follow the show, leave a positive review, or at least an honest review of the show, because that really helps grow the podcast, and then enjoy. That's it. But a quick caveat, if you've been listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, well, there's still going to be perks for you. With your Prime membership, you can listen to brand new Mr. Ballin podcast episodes 30 days early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the show right now is available everywhere and it is free. Enjoy the show. I want to create a mildly effective goal.
I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. Take its horn off its head and you beat it to death. Seagull! You die. Turned and leapt head first out the glass window. Pow! Yes! Got up on its flippers and began chasing us down the cave. A nice hot maga musk. And we settled on a piping hot plate of eagle tonsils, your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog, your zebra cornea souffle. Get to go surfing. Surfing. But I didn't. No! Pew! Yes, it did.
Papa, tu dois avoir.
Papa, tu dois avoir. Lungy was already in there, and he looks at me and he says, Papaye, deberíamos ter ficado con Hello Fresh. Oh, Lungy, put on... Ooh, Mr. Bolland. Ooh. It's not even funny. If you're wondering why I just shared a whole slew of me just butchering my various intros and different parts of Strange, Dark, and Mysterious videos, well, it's because you all asked for it. Last month, in our first ever Mr. Ballin newsletter, we posed a question. We said, what do you want me to share with you the most? And overwhelmingly, what you all wanted to see was a compilation of bloopers. And you don't want to miss the next newsletter because maybe there's something else you want to see, and that newsletter might give you a chance to actually see that thing happening. And also, remember, the newsletter encompasses basically everything we're up to, both things that are coming up in the future, things that you might have missed, what we're doing now, and it's designed to be really easy to consume. It's very visual. It's not all text. It's very beautiful. It's an incredibly good newsletter. And so to sign up, all you got to do is go to ballinstudios.com and input your email, and boom, you're signed up. Also, you can just click the link in the description below. That will also get you signed up for the newsletter. And then we will deliver it to you, once a month, and boom, there you go. You're in the know. So thank you to all the people who have already signed up. And in advance, thank you so much to those that are about to go sign up. And I'm sorry to those that plan to not sign up, because really, you're missing out. And you know what? Seagull Lung, he's going to be pretty disappointed in you, so there's that too. Okay? Peer pressure. Go get it done. ballinstudios.com. Sign up for our incredible monthly newsletter. Thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more Strange, Dark, and Mysterious videos, click here. Last weekend, I looked over and I saw old Seagull Lung sitting at his miniature 1999 era G3 iMac, and I couldn't help but notice he was looking a little downtrodden. And when I saw what he was doing on his iMac, I knew why. He was hitting refresh over and over and over again on his MySpace page, and it wasn't changing the numbers. Old Lung hasn't had a view on his MySpace page since 2010. To cheer him up, I decided I would purchase a MySpace view bot and flood his page with tens of views. So I ran over to my windmill-powered laptop and began slapping away at the keys to navigate to an online vendor that sold MySpace view bots. However, as soon as I clicked on the link, this website is a virus, not an online vendor for MySpace viewbots.com, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Unbelievably, that website was riddled with malware, and so immediately my windmill-powered laptop caught on fire and then exploded, sending shrapnel raining down on me. Luckily, old Lung was in the other room, and he heard the commotion, and he leapt into the room, and he pushed me out of the way just in time. And then after the dust had settled, old Lung gave me a big hug, and then slapped me right in the anti-tragus and said, Papa, wenn du ständig auf gefährliche Webseiten klickst, dann brauchst du NordVPN. Which, of course, in German means, Papa, if you're going to keep clicking on dangerous websites, then use NordVPN. And boy, was old Lungy right. A VPN, or Virtual Private Network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN keep your data safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, they will block malware hosting websites and annoying pop-up ads and botnet control. So, if your online shopping seems to always turn into explosions and other various catastrophes caused by malware-hosted websites, then you need to take old Lungy's advice too and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can sign up for a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus get 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallin. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallin, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story.